discourses that I'm trying to bridge in today's presentation. The sole understanding of the perspective that I have used in order to make sense of these two discourses and try and bridge the gap between the two is from the point of view of an artist or a sahridaya. So kindly pardon if I make mistakes, and kindly uh, throw open your questions so that I get a chance to unlearn and relearn as much as I can. So this is a very humble attempt. I submit humbly my understanding of how an interdisciplinary discursive space needs to be created between social sciences and humanities on one hand, and the natural sciences on the other hand, in order to make sense of the existing reality, consciousness, and other such esoteric questions, which is what many people from across disciplines, many neuroscientists have tried and asked these questions. And one of them, whom I'm going to specifically talk about in this particular session, is Dr. B.S. Ramachandran. I'll share the screen. Hope it's visible. Is it visible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. All right. So, yeah.
You can just do a full screen so that.
Yeah, I was trying that,
Yeah.
but I not happening. All right.
Below it'll be like there'll be a sign. Bottom to your right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Sorry for the inconvenience. And
Yeah.
all right. So, what is the first? Here's an image in front of you, and corresponding terms written alongside that, which represents various things. I thought of the mood that evoked in me was the pensive mood. I could see mountain clouds settling for the night and passing by crimson red valleys. I could think of Raga Pantorali, Raga Shri in Hindustani, and maybe it's getting played on a surbahar or a sitar. So you can draw so many interpretations out of an image, and which is obviously diverse. Now the point here is both neuroscientists on one hand, as well as Indian aestheticians on the other, through different approaches, through different means, and with different intent, they try to understand this question probably of what is creative expression and how can we make sense of creative aesthetic responses. Is it possible to study them uniformly? And I think this was one such question which was not being asked for a long time by scientists, which fortunately thinkers and researchers like Dr. B.S. Ramachandran did, and which is why the uh, which is why the conversation between these discourses that I have proposed in this particular topic. So neuroscientists would say it's a conversation. It's a conversation between different neurons in the brain. The holy grail of neuroscience lies in the quest for finding out meaning in neural connections. So these are called neural talks that are indeed vibrant, chaotic, and seems magical. However, it's a process that involves the presence of all or some of the following centers, which are cognitive, and emotional. There is a staggering, magnificent complexity of human brain, which not only contemplates about the vastness of universe, but also contemplates about the very act of contemplating and experiencing and feeling. Of the many questions, one of the concerns that opens up avenues for such a wide-scale investigation is How do you study esoteric abilities like like art, aesthetics, etc.? We hear phrases like, "Oh, you did a wonderful job. I didn't know. I don't know how it's done. It was an absolutely ethereal experience and difficult to make sense of. You lived the art. You became the art." So these are expressions, linguistic expressions that we use in order to try and make sense of these aesthetic responses. Neuroscientists, what they do is they do brain mapping, is one way that they adopt in order to find out and eavesdrop how neurons function. And there are many interesting techniques which I'm not going to be discussing because that's not part of the topic. But there are many interesting techniques. We have BrainNet bringing in fMRI, EEG, TMS, and many other quote unquote crazy techniques to find out how neurons talk to each other. And there are synaptic manifestations of creative expression that happens within the brain. And that's what constitutes what we are. Some of the actors which are present here, which are participant to creating these creative expressions in the mind are fusiform gyrus, angular gyrus, Wernicke's area, Broca's area. These are parts of the brain that are involved in the process of creative expression, and the list goes on. There are so many centers. One is a center for color, another is a center for symmetry, for numbers, and another is a center called the angular gyrus, which is one of the most important organs that we'll be discussing today for today's presentation, that creates the conceptual understanding or tries to find out a logical connectivity to our experiences. So we'll come to that soon. Yeah, so here's, I'll just, the intent again of this presentation is it should never be to constrict creative experiences strictly as into scientific or non-scientific barriers. I'm sorry, I'm reading, so I'll be reading snippets out of the script that I've prepared, which the purpose here is not to constrict into either scientific study or a non-scientific study or an intuitive study, because it erodes the beautiful complexity involved in understanding and feeling the art that the mind creates. So the intention is not to find out which one is better. The intention is to create a space wherein both can dialogue with each other and help each other out for the betterment of, for any reason. Like science helps in, it collaborates with music and brings in music therapy. And then you have artificial intelligence. You have a lot of avenues that will open up if we establish a dialogue. The second connection between the two is creativity. What both try and talk about is creative modes of expression. And according to me, that is also associated with the question of human agency. Where is the human agency lying? Is it already ingrained, or is it, of course, that has been the question of nature versus nurture. And even neuroscientists and who are part of cognitive neuroscience, they do say that neuroplasticity is a phenomenon that is widespread. Neurons do not remain the same. Neuron interactions, they keep changing based on our exposure, which is why you have training in arts. You are trained into becoming that. And of course, some people are born with certain intuitive powers to already do some things which others need not, others may not be able to. So yes, you have both intuitive as well as you have, the scope for training your brain and changing it. That is how the subdisciplines called epigenetics also emerged, which says you can change the patterns that are ingrained in your brain. It no more remains the same. That's how diverse and complex your brain is. The third point between the two, the third intent is to, according to me, is what underlies my findings in both these discourses, and based on so many references. It's not that this effort has not been done before, it has been done. So I am not going to take any credits for that, but as part of my findings, I feel the very basis of human creativity is empathy. Because empathy is something which is present in both. It is talked about by both neuroscience, neuroaesthetics, as well as Indian aestheticians. What underlies in my findings from both discourses, empathy, which is an active, conscious mind interacting with oneself and others. You're not only being sympathetic to what the other is going through, you're also trying to put yourself in the other person's shoe and finding out how they must be operating, which is the basis of creativity. And probably that's how we came up with so many kinds of art forms. We'll see soon how that has been conceptualized. So Yeah, so V.S. Ramachandran, what he did was he tried to uh, talk about, extensively study about a phenomenon called synesthesia. And through the study of synesthesia, he tried to connect uh, the, the, the question that Indian aestheticians asked so many years ago. From 3rd century BC to AD, we had Bharata Muni's Natya Shastra, which evoked so many of these questions, which involved questions connected to creative abilities. And encountered one such phenomenon called synesthesia in his experiments, Dr. Ramachandran, and thought this could help me ask questions related to creativity. And synesthesia, in short, is a condition which is a sensory stimulus presented in one modality that evokes a sensation in a different modality. For instance, there are people who see numbers, but when they see numbers, they also see colors. So that's very interesting. So some people do have this condition, which is why this is a very lower level synesthesia, where the organ that is involved is called fusiform gyrus. It's written in the presentation, which brings about very lower level understanding of connections. Synesthesia tries to connect two completely seemingly unrelated things together. So, which could probably explain why some people see colors when they listen to a raga, or why some people feel some emotion when they listen to a certain raga, or why is it that you feel like singing something because of a certain environment that you are present in. There are a lot of such connections which may seem unrelated literally to the naked eye, but there are connections that you're forming. And he termed it as in synesthesia was brought in by Sir Francis Galton long ago. He had found it out, but Dr. V.S. Ramachandran applied this concept to the study of creativity and to ask larger questions regarding whether brain can bridge the two disciplines or not. So synesthesia, so you had lower level synesthesia is when you see number, you see a color, or you see a color, you see numbers. Uh, Higher level synesthesia is when your ideas are conceptualized around those. For instance, even before you see a number, but you think it could be a number, you immediately see a color. So you're not seeing the number, you are only exposed to the idea of numerosity. There's a possible numerosity around, and immediately you have a color in mind. For some people, when you play, I've encountered people who say, I see a blue color when I switch on F sharp as my shruti before singing, or I see Wednesday is a blue day, or Saturday is a green day. These are two seemingly unrelated things which are getting together. Now that has a neuroscientific explanation in the concept synesthesia. But V.S. Ramachandran did not stop there. He thought maybe our creative expressions could have some links towards this understanding of synesthesia. So higher synesthesia is where angular gyrus is involved, where your conceptual formations happen. So Shakespeare writes, it is the east and Juliet is the sun. This is also an example that was quoted by Dr. Ramachandran. So it doesn't mean Juliet is a ball of fire. It's a metaphor. So that's how he came up with this conclusion, of course, through various experimentations, that metaphors could be a basis of creativity, where you try and link two seemingly unrelated things. So Juliet is the sun, should not be taken literally, and a brain which is exposed to metaphors and metaphorical reasoning in the angular gyrus will take that information and connect Juliet with the characteristics of the sun, not the sun literally. So he thought there could be some link between the neural mechanisms in the brain and creative formations and our verses. The way we say, so when I was taught music by my guru, there is this composition called Jaya 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 Janaki Kanta in Ragam Nate. Nate symbolizes Veera Rasa apparently. So when you sing, you have to evoke those brisk, notes. So it has to be Jaya 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 Janaki Kanta Jaya Sadhu Jana Vinuta Jaya Tu Mahimananda Jaya Tu Mahimananda. Without that Mahimananda sung in that way, probably the Veera Rasa, of course my voice is not meant for Veera Rasa, but that Veera Rasa might not be evoked. So it used to be told to me that you must sing it this way. Probably if you add this particular sangati, it's going to add on to the. So you are completely relating two different things. The part of the brain which is forming sangatis with the conception of virta or bravery, and so this is a higher level of metaphor which neuroscientists like Ramchandran says has a neural connection, has a neural mechanism to it. So when you form metaphors, you may be actually, there may be brain intracranial synaptic responses being generated between two seemingly unrelated centers of the brain. So these are the organs. Yeah. So for instance, when I saw, these are two images of the same concept, that is night. But when you see, when I saw the first image with only the moon, I could think of Raga Chandrakants, and goes like Gama Gama Dama Gasani Sada Nisa Gama Da Gama Da Gadama Nisa Gama Pani Ma Paga Nigasa Whereas the second image with the bird, so probably while I was looking at that, I was going through the emotional state that was predominant. Probably would have been longingness. The only raga that occurred to me was Raga Bhageshri, so it goes like da da na 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 da da na 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 da da na na So tell me if you can think of some song that you must have been exposed to, and maybe you could connect to the image that you saw. That's where the neural mechanism of synesthesia probably is happening in the brain. But for Vincent van Gogh, the night was a starry night. Now that's a fantastic imagery and a very different one from what we saw in the last slide. So quoting Van Gogh, his nocturnes to him appealed a lot, even more richly colored. He thought the night was more richly colored than the day, which is why the picture of the starry night. And whereas the most intense violets, blues, greens, etc. were present in the night. And probably that's why it evokes lively, bright notes of Raga Atana or Nate. So I'll leave that to a different day altogether because the presentation can deviate. So another synesthetic example. So this is how probably a synesthete might see the ragas as given in this slide. Another example was the Kiki and Buba phenomenon, which is mentioned in the, which is present on the right-hand side of the picture here. So of these two, now these are, imagine these are Martian alphabets, you're not aware of them. Which one of them is Kiki and which one is Buba? For most, it was found that the amoeba-like structure could be Buba and the one which is shaped like a star could be Kiki. Even though you didn't know of this, probably you must have, most of you must have. Of course, it doesn't bar diverse explanations. There are multiple explanations to this. But what he found out was there is a sudden inflection. There is a connection between the visual shape that mimics the auditory sound of Kiki. Maybe that's why even without our knowledge, we came up to this conclusion that this image could be Kiki and the other could be Buba. That's an example of synesthesia. Another example of an editor who says that she feels like when she's searching for words and it doesn't come out, she feels like she's in the middle of a mist. She's walking through the mist. The things that connect the two, the mist and search for word, is lack of clarity. So probably her angular gyrus. This is how V.S. Ramchandran would explain this phenomenon as. The angular gyrus in the brain is trying to connect it with a metaphorical image of walking through the mist. And if you see, so many of our compositions are composed with multiple layers of meanings. And why he connected synesthesia with creativity was because more than 8 times it was prevalent in artists, painters across art forms, that was found through experimentation. So the breakthrough that he came up with was, he asked so many questions concerning which are seemingly not very visible and not very calculable, but he still did, which is where he was opening up the science, the borders of the science, and entering into humanities, arts, and social sciences. He proposed that there could be aesthetic universal principles that can help us study creativity, which are grouping, isolation, etc. I'll just go through some. So in this image, this is an image by Mohan Thomas shot at Kabini, and you immediately see one leopard, and then you see another tail, but you cannot look at the second head. And all of a sudden, you see there is a second head somewhere here, which is camouflaged with the bark of the tree. Yeah, I hope you saw it. I'm just circulating it. So, yeah, so the human mind immediately tries to group. That's what he called under grouping. I mean, he called as grouping. The human mind, by default, there are brain mechanisms which tries to group and find out meaning from what you see. So probably that could be an aesthetic universal that we all do in order to respond to the work of art. But the context, the situation, the environment, everything matters. Probably if I were in the forest, right there in front of it, I would have been more cautious, and maybe I would have seen it faster than me sitting in the closed doors and seeing it safely. So yeah, this is all left for experimentation. Now, this is a Google Doodle dedicated to Mario Miranda on his 90th birthday. But this is not Mario Miranda's doodle, but there are so many colors. And more the colors, the more active the visual centers are. And you try and group what color is associated with what, etc. Also, you try and group words out of hashtags too. Hashtags are words without any breaks, but we still follow it because our brain is trying to group. And this is another example of grouping and contrast. All right, so another effect is peak shift effect or hyperbole. Here, the artist tries to create doodles or make images of objects which turn out to be much more real than they themselves, by exaggerating certain areas, certain critical characteristic features of the art or of the subject. So the artist consciously engages in enhancing what he or she finds distinct in the facial feature of Amitabh and makes it appear more real than himself. That's why doodles evoke a lot of attraction and attention. It sustains your attention for a long time, because even though they're not real, you are ready to keep aside logic and completely surrender to art. And probably that's why peak shift effect or hyperbole does explain our responses, our aesthetic and artistic responses. So, and this was isolation. This is another aesthetic principle that P.S. Ramachandran explains as, which is an explanatory, very good explanatory device to understand creativity. These are 3 different drawings. One, the extreme right, the hideous drawing of a horse. I'm using adjectives again, attaching values and judgments and opinions, which is also what the brain does. Sorry to say, but yeah, it looks a bit hideous. Why? Because the real horse that we see is completely different from that. So that's the image that was drawn by a 7-year-old boy, or 7-year-old person like me who has very little drawing skills. Whereas on the extreme left, you have the drawing by a 7-year-old child who is autistic, and her name is Nadia, where the strokes are very freestyled, and it evokes the exact characteristic of what a real horse looks like. Even better than the middle one, probably because it's more symmetric and more structured. Here it's more freestyle towards the middle. And the middle one is a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, the famous painter. So there was this, out of these series of experiments, what was founded was, Scientifically, of course, there can be flaws, there can be multiple interpretations to it, but what was found was in brains where there are synaptic connections which are severed or damaged, the chance that they are going to only focus on the art part of the brain, or the emotional centers are higher. So what takes that person a minute would take probably me a year to figure out how to draw it, because I am not skilled at it. So isolation. So isolation is also one of these techniques that he explained as an explanatory device to understand creativity. Now, these are two different depictions of the city. You must have seen the first one in the previous slide. The first one is Fernand Léger's The City. The second is Mario Miranda's Understanding of Bombay. Both are cities, different visions of chaos, asymmetry within some understanding of symmetry. Yeah. So synesthesia provides a link. There are many other, and synesthesia also explained how there are neurons within our body which empathizes with an activity that happens in front of us. So which is why probably if you see somebody in pain, or somebody's hand caught fire, and your empathy neurons, he jokingly calls it Gandhi neurons. Empathy neurons, they empathize, and you feel as if something is happening to you, but you wouldn't budge, you wouldn't say ouch, because your skin sends out messages to the brain that relax, it's not you are not the one who is going through this, but you are empathizing with what is happening. And this has been experimentally found to explain how there are mirror neurons. He calls it mirror neurons or empathy neurons, which are present, which fires in our brain even if we see something happening, which is why we cry. This could be a reason why we cried when we saw someone else cry on screen, someone whom we like crying or dying on screen, even though we know it is not real. But there are contradictory commentaries and explanations which are present in the Indian aesthetics. I'll quickly move on to that. I think I'm left with 10 minutes. Meera? Exactly, yeah. So the next segment is Rasa theory and its commentaries, as mentioned in Nadi Shastra and by other commentators like Abhinava Gupta, Sri Shankuka, etc. Though I'm not going to be focusing on all of these because I have to fit it under this larger question that I'm dealing with. So I have drawn whatever little I could based on my limited readings. So Bharata Muni's Natya Shastra has remained a significant and the first amongst many treatises on a wide range of aspects concerned with dramatics and histrionics. There are 36 chapters, and most of you must be aware of the basics, but I could provide you with references for further detailed reading. But it talks about a strategic, elaborate understanding of how to evoke rasa. It talks about bhava, abhinaya, nayak, naika, their characterizations, by bringing about a strategic combination of grace, knowledge of language, and gestures. The fundamental concerns that were raised by Bharata Muni was, what is rasa? Is rasa a reality? If it exists, is it a reality? What is its nature? Understanding the feeling is not rasa, but understanding the form of feeling is. So emotion is not rasa. Emotion is bhava. Bhava cannot be rasa. This is what Bharata Muni responds as. It's a dialogue. It's written in a dialogical form. So Bharata Muni says that the bhava cannot be associated with rasa. It's when the bhava mixes and interacts actively with other elements. Now we look at those elements. That is when the rasa is formed. Otherwise, the artist would succumb to the existing bhava. The artist would succumb to the bhava, but that should not happen. The artist may or may not experience the bhava, but should not succumb to it. Must evoke an elevated consciousness of that bhava or that feeling with the help of various other elements and produce rasa. And the better the artist or the success of an artist rather is associated with how long can the rasa be sustained. not only in the artist but also in the spectator. So I hope, yeah, that's clear. So it's a process which is not only cognitive but also intuitive. How can the process be conceptualized or made sense of? The rasa. So there are vibhavas or determinants. As I said, there is a context, there are causes, which are also called hetu or nimitta. Then there are responses. There is something that determines your bhava, and then there are responses. There are 8 sthai bhavas according to Bharata Muni. 8 of them are rati, love, hasa or joy or mirth, shoka or sadness, and then krodha, anger, etc. Whereas vyabhichari bhavas are the ones who are transitory. They keep changing. They are not permanently situated. Satvika bhavas are the temperamental states, which talks about the elevated uh, projection of a certain bhava through abhinaya. So I have to project that I am extremely touched by the existing context. So that is romancha. It's like goose flesh. Now, how do I project that? So there are subtle movements for that, which Bharata Muni extensively writes about. Those are satvika bhavas, which are very deep and intense. So an amalgam of all these leads to the elevated sthai bhava, and that is what is rasa. Rasa is not expression, it is the form of expression. It's different from bhavas. It requires all these bhavas to combine and interact. Again, I remember one such incidence. Again, I'll draw a lot of examples from what I have, been through, which is what has made me connect to these concepts. So I had once asked my guru, why is it that MS Subbalakshmi, when she renders Bhavyami Gopala Balan, why doesn't she choke? Because she renders it with such sensitivity and so much of emotion that you end up choking listening to it. And I can never bring myself to sing. So she said she's gathered that strength. The response was that she gathered that strength of the consciousness, which is intuitive in nature and which is consciously done in order to evoke a certain expression, which she will not succumb to, but she only will give on to others, pass it on to others. That's the duty of an artist, and which is something that the rasa theory also talks about. So the sthai bhavas, or the permanent states, are the most important bhavas of all. Every other bhavas follow it, and that is what is mentioned in chapter 7 of the Natya Shastra. So basically, it depends on where is the human agency. Where is the agency located? The agency is located within the human, wherein the sthai bhavas are present in a certain position, and through exposure, training, consistency, practice, etc., that could elevate. You will know exactly how to elevate that and create a rasa of sorts, which then can be enjoyed by the listener. So it lies on you. It doesn't lie on your environment or on the anticipation of what you want to evoke. Those bhavas, they follow the sthai bhavas. This was what Bharata Muni wrote. Abhinavagupta comes in as a response to this and says, still the human doesn't completely turn into an agent here. The artist who is present doesn't become the agent or the voice of the art entirely, because Bharata Muni has simplistically, created a certain given an orderly treatment to the formation of rasa. It's not so simplistic, is what Abhinavagupta comes and says. Because there is a diversity of knowledge, ideas, thoughts, and realities which can be explained. There are many who understand the consciousness as one. There are many who understand the consciousness as dual. Abhinavagupta belonged to the non-dualist Shaiva tradition. He asked the question again. He repeated the question: what is rasa? If there is rasa, where is it located? What is the nature of this reality? What is the indelible, unwavering, aware, conscious mind? How can you reach that elevated state? Who has the powers to help you reach there? If it is aesthetics, so he says that it is aesthetics that, or the ecstatic bliss that the mind craves for, helps you out of your, respective positions and pushes you towards the elevated consciousness. So if it is aesthetics that leads the mind to the experience of, ecstatic bliss, how should it be practiced or realized? And where is it located? Ramchandran would say it's located in the brain. So we need to study the brain thoroughly. We need to analyze, divide, do, analyze so many phenomena and patients and different conditions, and then maybe we can come up with some understanding of, because there are universal principles which can explain creativity, is what he would say. Abhinava Gupta says it lies not only in the heart of the artist, but also in the heart of the spectator. That is when aesthetic responses, uh, that is when you're able to achieve that ecstatic bliss of aesthetic response. So the terms that are mentioned in this particular slide summarizes in some way what Abhinava Gupta tries to say. He says Bharata Muni had told, rasa is created by the artist and it travels and reaches the spectator. Almost like, and then you empathize with it and then you enjoy or you become participant to it. But it travels from the creator, from the artist. This is very similar to the mirror neuron understanding of neuroscience, where you are mirroring what I am going through, or you are experiencing exactly what I'm going through, if not exactly the same, but similar. But Abhinava Gupta says he tried to locate the, cerebrally understand this concept of, aesthetic responses. He tries to explain by giving the example of a tree. He says, Tatra bija sthaniyam abhinayato rasa. So the rasa formation happens through a seed. Just as the seed emerges into a full-blown tree, that is how you experience rasa. So rasa is not something that travels from the artist to the spectator. You also, the spectator or the rasika is the spectator, is one who enjoys art, is also an active creator, which is very similar to that of the artist. They both are not distinct from each other. So just like a seed that blossoms, the rasa within you, based on your exposure, your knowledge, your cognitive abilities, your emotive skills, your understanding, your open-mindedness, your empathy, and it creates a magic that makes the rasika also the creator or the agent of creativity, not only the artist. So the artist is incomplete. The artist and the spectator, they both have equal, the agency of creativity lies in both. And that is a combination of the two is what forms creativity. And that is what is mentioned in this particular slide. So through Vimarsha, Swatantriya, free will, and Abhinaya, they won't unite and form one, but it is all connected to some uniform understanding. However, they may not be the same, but they are definitely similar, is what Abhinava Gupta wrote. And for him, rasa utpatti was, and creativity was equated with a stream of consciousness, including so many bhavas that are mentioned in this slide. So to conclude, the most important aspect of both the discourses is the fact that both of them talk about certain common aspects, of course, in different ways, in different manners. And what I have tried to do was to bridge the two, to if not bridge, at least draw parallels and find out traces that connects the two. So I'll show to you what are the traces that I came across. The first one is imitation. Yeah. Abhinava Gupta and Bharata's explanation of rasa or creativity takes myriad forms. The form in Bharata resembles mimicry, that is explained in neuroscience as well, where the spectator tries to mimic or imitate or understand what is being passed on to them, and which is also explained in neuroscience in the form of empathy neurons. It talks about mirror neurons, neuroscience talks about mirror neurons as empathetic neurons that help one perceive what the other must be going through based on a complex interaction between cognitive and emotive centers. The crux, and probably this could also have been the basis of evolution of life and of art, because we had the capabilities, or we did decisively wanted to empathize with the surroundings. The crux behind the production of art itself lies in the imitation. However, Abhinavagupta looks at creative expressions as not only reducing the entire process as being based on only empathy or mimicry, he talks about both either exaggerated or non-exaggerated ways of expressing. And for instance, you have in the rasa theory, you have the loka dharmi and the natya dharmi concepts. Natya dharmi is when you evoke, when you use gestures which you normally wouldn't see in order to evoke the same meaning. So if natya dharmi mein, if you want to call somebody, you might say come and like this. And whereas in loka dharmi, it would be just come here, which, you know, both of these expressions are what an artist can use. So yeah, it's not merely an imitation. It could be an exaggerated form of imitation or a reduced understanding of, or a minimal understanding of what you see can be associated with art. So these are the two different ways in which both discourses look at the concept of imitation. Second is repetition. Very interesting. It was found as a result of experimentation, scientific experiments, that musical improvisation involves brain regions associated with skills that underlie everyday improvisational action. So when your brain is exposed to music, those centers of your brain become active, which is connected to your routine tasks like cleaning or just breathing or say speaking or thinking or sitting, standing, walking, etc. These are the routine tasks, and the creative centers are also associated with these, or improvisational centers are associated with these areas, which is probably why these music traditions, they emphasize so much on repetition, on practicing, on building symmetries, so that those centers of the brain are activated, and when comes a time for you to improvise, you are able to do it even without thinking, and you feel as if it came from somewhere else. So experimentally, neuroscience says that those areas of the brain which are creative centers, so-called creative centers, are also associated with your mundane task of living. And this is also something, interestingly, what Abhinava Gupta writes in Abhinava Bharati. He says one creative behavior is decomposed into experimentally traceable cognitive functions. These component functions may turn out to be the same function involved in behavior that is generally thought to be non-creative or mundane. So even Abhinava Bharati writes about that. It may be the case that the construct of creativity simply cannot be defined in terms of cognition. It can be or something that occurs in a minute or less. It has to be associated with your routine mundane activities, which was also the basis of a Gurukula structure of education. So repetition is a very interesting, which is why in Hindustani classical tradition and music training, you have something called paltas or ragas, where you have structures which you are asked to repeat and think. So while you sing paltas, you are not only constructing notes, you're also thinking about what note should come next. You will make mistakes a lot of time, but then when you keep practicing that, your mundane routine centers of the brain are activated, and when it comes to improvisation, you're able to do it. Anyway, these are there are experimental evidences for that. But even if we don't wait for experimental evidences, it has been also expounded by extremely great, talented artists like Srimati Kaushiki Chakrabarti in one of her workshops that I had the chance to attend. So yeah, and the third connectivity between the two is isolation. Both of them talk about isolation as a phenomenon that exists in creative expression. You saw the image of the horse. In Chitraturaga Nyaya, Sri Shankuka writes, the creator knows and still chooses to believe in something that's seemingly not real. Metaphor works with the same principle. You know Juliet is not the sun, but you want to believe in it because it evokes certain emotions regarding your understanding of Juliet, better than Juliet herself. So cognitive and intuitive are different processes and sometimes are interspersed with each other, but neuroscience says the study of brain mechanisms can help bridge the gap. Abhinava Gupta and others may be talking about this very isolation, but as an experience that is aimed at leading towards the creation of rasa. The artist isolates oneself from the emotions knowingly and exhibits a rasa for everyone to enjoy without succumbing to the emotions. So the artist also goes through isolation, just like maybe the receptor also is going through that. This could have led into this could have led him to create the ninth rasa, which is the Shanti rasa. This again is a speculation, which carries synesthetic abilities, according to one of the uh, professor of art history, Professor Deepak Kannal. He calls this particular rasa as a synesthetic rasa with synesthetic abilities that can create balance in the mind on for different centers of the brain. So you can find there are so many connections with completely different discourses between two completely different discourses. So to end, rasa theory is more than a theory of aesthetics, which is why it's very essential to open it up for other discourses to also engage with it. It's a structural analysis of the totality of human experience and behavior, and it is based in particular conceptions of experience, being, knowledge, and cognitive mechanics. That's why the link has to be opened up. The role of a human as an agent with the agency to create, imitate, exaggerate, reproduce, and sustain rasa is unimagined. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. Are there any videos that you would like to share, or
I tried, I wanted to, it was just a line rider. If you're aware of this principal concept of line rider, maybe I could share it in the email because for some reason it was not open at this point. But
yeah,
for the first time, Mad Rasna came up with this concept of using Carnatic music to show a certain composition in the form of lines, as if someone is sledging through snow and there is a certain wavy pattern to it, and it is corresponding with a certain Carnatic music composition. So you get an idea of how those notes are sung. So that was the exercise. I can share the link in the chat.
okay. Thank you, Aparna, for the wonderful lecture. Okay, we already have one question now from Atul Pratap. So I request you to please say your question. Sir, you're unmuted.
Okay, thank you. I hope I am audible.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
yes.
Yeah. So yeah, my question is on. It was a nice presentation. So my question is something on the theme we are talking about, the Saka as active creator in the creation. So that's a wonderful concept, and that's how every art form should be. But how much of that is possible through the current media industry? So I feel like there is something missing in the current mode that where in the media, whether it be art or dance or anything, is consumed. So what do you think how this gap can be filled wherein both of these creator and the Rasaka is at the same state of transcendental enjoyment? That's my question. Okay, what is missing there? Thank you.
Thank you. Should I answer or are you going to take
Yeah,
the
yeah.
question?
Please proceed with the answer.
Thank you, sir, for the question. And yeah, no, it's the anomaly. I mean, virtual space is twin-sided. It has two sides to it, Janus-based. Uh, it, the best aspect of it is that it can connect a lot of things. But yeah, the virtual space and with media coming in and social media per se, even though it has opened up a lot of avenues, it creates a certain barrier of sorts. But maybe constantly and consistently exposing yourself to quality content. And again, quality content is a judgmental term. So that's again left to you. So ultimately, the responsibility lies in the consumer too. You need to know, you need to distinguish whether yourself from a consumer, whether you are a consumer, a um, rationally guided consumer who is here, rational in the sense also morally, ethically, or whatever, guided consumer who is here to consume the, the the contents that are available to made available to you. So bridging the gap, which is interpersonal spaces through a virtual space, is never possible, but maybe we can take the best out of what is offered to us. And yes, it has maligned, it has created a lot of discrepancies and a lot of problems in the transmission of or creating an environment, especially Gurukul system is something which we miss a lot these days. I don't know if, I'm not sure, I've not read much about it, but while I was researching, I made a reference somewhere with the system which talks about creating the determinants or the environment for you to enable you to practice it. But no matter which situation you are in, ultimately the responsibility lies with the artist as well as the consumer. So I think you have the ability to even change or bring about changes in the existing surroundings, virtual surroundings.
Okay, thank you. Gopesh Jha has a question. I'll request Gopesh to please proceed with his question.
Thanks, Niharika, for giving me a chance. First of all, like to compliment the speaker for a wonderful and brilliant, mind-boggling talk in a way. I want to ask, I'm a guy who is interested and enthusiastic about evolutionary human evolution. So there also we talk about synesthesia, semiotics, or phenomenology. We see two kind of different culture dynamics. That is, one is structured and one is completely non-structured because of the isolation. How you think why it is so important to address both of the part while understanding these things? Because sometimes even in synesthesia, you put a certain kind of influence or bias in front of a receiver that one individual receives in particular structured manner, and that has been transmitted to the upcoming generations. But certain times, certain thing can be completely out of the structure, which can't be understand or defined within that whole filter or whole parameter. So how you say this, like understanding these things, what could be the basic parameters or what could be the basic methodology in order to understand the dynamics of these two things?
Well, that's an interesting question, but I, through this particular presentation at least, I didn't intend on showing that there should be, I didn't intend on suggesting that there has to be a singular methodology or a technique or an approach to study numerously abstract events and phenomenon that is happening. So you may, so you have, for instance, peak shift. Peak shift talks about exaggeration of apparently normal features that are present in front of you. Again, there is a judgment. There is an inherent bias. There is an inherent hierarchy in the very understanding of rasa too, which needs to evolve with the changing times, which is probably why the presentation aimed at associating both to a certain concept, that is creativity. And again, your definition of creativity can change. I based it on the concept of empathy, not even sympathy, because when I sympathize, I'm positioning myself hierarchically above you. And I'm just looking at you with some pity in my heart. Empathy is different. So empathy almost equalizes the space. So maybe I took into consideration an equal space and a just space, a more just space, if I may use a very universally abstract term. But which is why these studies can have millions of diverse ranges, and it can go into different dimensions, and it should for the very reason that it cannot be defined within a certain paradigm, and it should not be. And Abhinava Gupta's commentary still remains so prevalent because he, in his times, completely subverted the very understanding of rasa that Bharata Muni evoked in Natyashastra. And as something that is an interactive, as a result of interaction that is active, where everyone's creative expression has to be merged into each other. And creativity can never follow an orderly treatment. It has to break barriers. It has to, I'm not saying it needs to always, but it should if it wants to. So.
Thank you. Mr. Sangam and Shivang will get back to you. We'll just take 3 questions from the chat box, then I'll unmute you. Just bear with us for 5 minutes. So one of the questions in the chat box is, how is aesthetics related to religion?
Aesthetics is associated with response to beauty. Aesthetics is the study of that. Western and Indian aestheticians have dealt with this in their own different ways. Western aesthetics talked about, so again, this is a very generic question. You have to place it on, you have to, specifically ask, but I'm broadly going to answer. So Western aestheticians talked about different the art, which is why it is very abstract, whereas Indian aestheticians not only talked about art, but also the art forms, which are very, structured and very elaborate and comprehensive. And therefore, you might find Indian aesthetics as a more structured one in comparison to the West. But both of them talked about the response that human mind creates, different mental states. Chitradurga talks about four different variations of four different aspects of knowledge, and Plato talked about in aesthetics talked about four different mental states. So I think again the conception of religion came in with the intention of morally creating a moral social order, and therefore it does influence the way in which we perceive the world. And so far as consciousness and the understanding of nature of reality is concerned, religion definitely plays a role. Even it played a role with how Indian aestheticians looked at the concept of rasa. Like for Abhinava Gupta, it was associated with one whole consciousness, and whereas for Bharata that was not the case. For Shankara it was not the case. They looked at the world as unreal, as full of maya, whereas Abhinava Gupta considered the world as real, which has the element of maya in it, but it is definitely real, which is why you sit through a performance even though you know it is seemingly unreal, but you sit through, you keep aside logic and engage with emotions and embrace art. Therefore, religion to a very large extent definitely affects the way we perceive aesthetics, because aesthetics is not only concerned with how we respond to beauty, but it is also concerned with larger questions of consciousness and reality.
Thank you. Amrita, we'll just circle back to you. There are two more questions in the chat box, then I'll just start unmuting people. So one more question for you, Aparna, is some people are, by watching some empathetic work, instead of evoking Karuna Rasa, they turn up inflating pain on themselves. So according to your understanding, where is the correction to be made?
No, there is no correction that's supposed to be made. Empathy doesn't really mean you evoke the same rasa that the creator wants you to evoke. There may be similarity, but they need not be the same. So watching the same image of night has evoked in me pain because I longed for somebody and I ended up singing Ragabhagishri. But for someone else, it evoked the dark, heavy clouds, which symbolizes maybe anger or a different state of mind. So there is no correction to be made. If at all you talk about correction, there has to be a paradigm or a parameter that has to be set to decide what is right or wrong, which is not set and which should not be set. But however, to explain and understand as explanatory devices, neuroscience and Indian aestheticians, they try and come up with aesthetic universals to say that some of the Indian aestheticians, again, not everyone, they try and explain how creativity, how the process of creativity or how the form of rasa can be evoked. It's not, they never come and say this is the definition of, however, Bharatamuni does associate the concept of rasa with drama, and he says this should be applied to all art forms. He doesn't extend it, but he leaves it open for everyone to extend it to any art form that you want. So again, that's an open-ended research right there. So there is no need for correction. You can evoke different bhavas and still become a part of the same rasa. So it's a happy moment for some, but somebody else bursts out laughing, whereas someone else bursts into tears. So these are two different responses to the same. There's no need for correction. And the diversity should be celebrated.
Okay. Thank you, Aparna. We'll just take one more question shortly from the chat box. I see all the hand raised. I'll just unmute you. Just give me some time for it. So one question is from Dilip. So he's asking, adding to the concept of a picture reminding of rasa, raga. We can look at Ragamala paintings where raga inspires the picture. So has there been any study on these paintings?
Yes, based on very limited reading, there has been, and there are so many paintings which are being studied by trying to connect what emotion a certain raga brings out with the colors, with the strokes, etc. But since I'm not part of that discipline, I won't have enough information on that question. But yes, there has been a lot of studies, and probably for the very same reason as to understand, connect to seemingly literally to the naked eye, it may look very different, but it may be evoking a lot of similar things.
Preet, would you like to comment on this question?
Thank you. I just wanted to say that there has been extensive work done on the Ragamala paintings, on like the sole intention was to convey a particular raga. So like it could be Vasanta, where the painting, it shows out sprouting of new leaves of flowers coming up. Or that could be Rag Basant. There could be Rag Asaveri, where you would see a snake. So there are certain specifications in the painting which would convey what the raga is. That was the sole intention of Ragavala painting. But again, according to Ms. Aparna's, I think the explanation, they could fit into various other aspects also, that it could invoke various other rasas, not just restricted to certain aspects. If I could share the readings if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Preet. Thank you, Aparna. So yeah, I'll request Sangam to please proceed with this question.
So my question is regarding various ways that architects and so many artists design nowadays public spaces. And even in UK for Euro, they appointed a neuroscientist to design their currency notes to avoid the use of counterfeit currencies and distinct their currencies from the counterfeit currencies. So, so we have known for the longest time that art and neuroscience and science can go together, and a lot of scientific researches have been delayed because most scientists were not artists. So, and public spheres, there have been places abroad where they have staircases which are musical. They have places which actually encourages you to be creative. So how can we enhance our public spaces to induce creativity, and how great a role can all the aspects or all the disciplines of art can play in improving our sciences and people who we have trusted to be better our worlds, and make it more interesting rather than mundane, which we see with all the glass buildings in our cities nowadays. So, yeah, that's
very interesting question and a very thought-provoking one. Something which I've not thought of, but yeah, it must have been there in the back of my mind. But to begin with, we may stop calling scientists who concern themselves with art and artists who concern themselves with science crazy. We can maybe begin with that, and also really bring into practice empathy by opening up questions and alternatives regarding your deep-rooted understanding of anything, of any space, even in the architectural design of our universities or buildings. Is it open for people who are differently abled? Question mark. Are there? I'm just connecting it randomly to anything because that was a very broad question. Do we have washrooms for transgenders? I always wondered where would they go. So that talks about empathy. It talks about, and that is what will evoke creative abilities in your mind and will make you think as to how can I restructure the space in a way that it's inclusive, or in a way that is less judgmental. Even though I'm dealing with extremely esoteric abstract concepts, I can choose not to be judgmental. So that's what you call metacognition. In fact, Foucault, if I may bring in politics a bit, Foucault was was a thinker who said that the metacognition, the actual cognitive abilities lie outside of the brain. And which is also very similar to what neuroscientists say when they say that the outer layer of the brain is what is involved in metacognition. So probably there are so many connections, and maybe to begin with, how we empathize in the language that we use, in the way we perceive ourselves, because the creator is not disconnected from the subject that you're perceiving. Is the belief, is a premise that I hold on to. Of course, that is also contestable, but I think a lot of things can change, and that can also invoke creative interaction.
Thank you, Aparna. Quickly go through Shivang's question, and Amrita and Sindhushri, we are just coming to your question after this one. So, Shivang, please proceed with your question.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
Shivang,
you,
you're
ma'am.
audible.
Yeah. Thank you for this amazing talk, ma'am. My question is, I would like to ask a question regarding the theory of aesthetics. And here in Gujarati literature, there is a one critic, Narsirao Divetia, who says that aesthetic is not only talk about beauty or saundarya. Aesthetic is means that there is something beyond the object which we cannot see. That is something which is beyond the object. So could you please tell us something about the theory of aesthetics and what Narsirao Divetia said about what I have said? Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, I suddenly what comes to my mind, based on what little I read, was that even Abhinava Gupta tries to talk about this, the larger questions through 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 enactment in a drama, for instance, through abhinaya. So Satvik Abhinaya. Satvik Abhinaya uses temperamental states where you have to enact Ashru or Romancha, which cannot be done until you get into that, you feel, you immerse in that character. And for which you need to be exposed, either cognitively or intuitively, to be in that space. For some, it's easy, for some, it takes practice, for some, it takes training, but it's possible, is what is written, which is very interesting. Why? Because here, the final art that you create and the response that you get, which is what the study of aesthetics is all about, is being connected to how you have perceived reality. So it's not only about beauty, it's also about how you have perceived it. Van Gogh's very famous quote, he says, it's not about the truth or the beauty, it's about what you thought while creating it. And therefore, the theory of aesthetics is associated with all these dimensions of our lives. And yeah.
Amrita, please proceed with your question. I'll request everyone to keep their questions a little short because we are running a little ahead of time. So yeah, Amu, please.
Thank you, Aparna, for a wonderful lecture. So my question is regarding, like, in Indian aesthetics, we have separate terms like vibhavas and anubhavas and all, and then we have satvika bhavas, and then we move on to the rasa, right? And in between, there is also the concept of sadharanikarana or the generalization. So with respect to like neuro aesthetics, is there a differentiation between the acts? Like, for example, there is karya and karana in like day-to-day events, whereas in art forms, when it comes as vibhavas and anubhavas, and then the ultimate result is that of ananda. So with respect to like neuro aesthetics, or is there such a distinction between the day-to-day events and that of when you do it an aesthetic process?
No, at least not from what V.S. Ramachandran told, because in fact I didn't bring in Sadharanikarana because it would have, I don't know how, I was not able to connect it. But yes, there is a connection, and there even in from a neuroscience perspective, which was specifically brought out by Dr. Ramachandran, he experimentally proved that those centers which are apparently considered to be creative or evoking creative responses or aesthetic artistic responses need not be coming from centers that are only catering to mundane activities, so which seemingly don't feel like it's creative, but I do not agree again with that, because even mundane has an essence of, a touch of creativity in it, which probably is explained very well by V.S. Ramachandran in one of his articles, where he says it's proven that both these centers are the same, and they are evoked from the same areas of the brain, and therefore probably they may also not be creating that distinction. In fact, quantum mechanics and quantum physics, if I could bring in, the basis itself is that you cannot create a distinction between the two, yet you see that there could be a distinction, like the wave and the particle becoming the same, the matter and the wave being the same at the very same time. So I'll have to work on that more.
Thank you. We'll just quickly take the question from Sindhushri, then Bhagyashri, and one from Romi, then we come back to Meera for a chairperson's comment. So Sindhu, if you can keep it just a brief question, please.
Yes, I will try, Niharika. Thank you so much. I first want to start with appreciating Aparna. She's a very good speaker, and I see how highly informed she is in different areas. My question was, when you spoke about synesthesia, there is the exact opposite, not exact opposite, maybe the opposite of his, that is aphantasia. I don't know how to pronounce that. That is when a person can't imagine, they don't have a mental picture, they will they have the trouble when you say an apple, they can't imagine, picture an apple. And to them, the kids who are suffering with this, or the people who suffer with this or are born with this, the initial treatment is always to start with pictures like dancing and classical dance. This actually helps more than music. Actually, the dance helps because they don't have to imagine it.
Right.
They don't, I mean, these are the people who have trouble just reading books with no images at all because they can't picture them. Did you come across anything when you were reading about it through with aesthetics, if you have worked with people who've had such a...
I haven't personally worked with anybody. I have drawn whatever I said based on the readings and based on their references. But yes, based on my conversations with some professors, especially Professor Shankar from NIAS, I had approached him for some help regarding this presentation because I was totally going through this. He did mention, there was a point when he did write a point to me which said that when it comes to emotions, a lot of emotions, you cannot tease out cognitive steps that are involved. It happens so quickly, which is why probably music and dance affect somebody even at a higher intensity than any other activity that can be cognitively studied or teased out. The steps can be teased out. So maybe that's why music and dance, or maybe dance more than music, based on your findings, is used in order to evoke the those imaginary, those centers, especially the angular gyrus sphere, which is that area of the brain that imagines the concept, the basis of the matter. So perhaps these synaptic connections could have been cut due to a lot of reasons, but which could change is what epigenetics talks about, because neuron connections are not fixed. They keep changing based on your exposure and consistency. So probably that could be the reason why bringing in dance and music can be looked at as a, that's why they are used as therapy. Not very well read on that, but
no, thank you. That was. We can maybe continue chatting about it.
Sure.
I think a connected question was in the chat box by Romi. Bhagishri will just come back to you just a minute. Romi had a question by asking, sorry, yeah. Are there studies on the way children understand or empathize with art, particularly instrumental music? So I thought that's somewhat a connected question to what Sindhu asked. So would you like to comment on it, Aparna?
No, there might be studies, there might be, I'm sure, a lot of studies, which is why in music therapy, for instance, instrumental music is also widely used. If not exposing them to that, teaching them that, or making them equipped to practice their hand movements in a certain measurement, in a certain pattern and time, within a certain time period, can improve a lot of can activate so many centers of the brain. Even seeing an object activates more than 31 centers of your brain. So doing these activities, especially instruments, you have this, actually all instruments, you have this ability to invoke, it has the ability to invoke so many centers which are doing a lot of things at the same time. You're not only doing it, you're also associating your brain with a certain symmetry or a pattern. You're also repeating it, you're also practicing it. So yeah, there must have been a lot of researches done on that.
Thank you. We'll quickly take a question from Bhagyashree, and please don't worry if some of your questions are not answered in the chat box or you have questions. So Meera Kumar will be opening the WhatsApp groups, both of them. You can ask your questions there, and Aparna will be answering to those questions. And if possible, she'll also share her email address if you want to, directly communicate with her. So all that will be done on the WhatsApp group. So if your question is missed here, don't worry, you'll get an opportunity. So Bhagyashree will just proceed with your question. Yeah. Oh. Bhagyashree, I'm trying to, yeah.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, so hi Aparna. Well, it was a wonderful presentation, like I said, and what made it more special was that we saw this topic from the perspective of a great vocal artist like you. So that made it very special. My question was that in your reading of all of these theories, or maybe in your own reading of what you looked at, what is the influence of one's cultural conditioning on one's aesthetic response? Because like you gave an example of grouping with respect to, hashtags like words. But in linguistics, it is considered that this is something that only members who share the same linguistic community can do. So is it something similar when it comes to aesthetics, that, our concept of beauty is culturally rooted? So is there any explanation or engagement with this question in the theories you saw, that to what extent does our cultural conditioning influence our aesthetic response?
Not from V.S. Ramachandran. He does acknowledge that diversity exists, but he was more enthusiastic about coming up with universal aesthetic principles. However, he does acknowledge that cultural diversities and conditioning plays a very important role in how you perceive something, which is why Western aestheticians, when they came to India and Western connoisseurs of art, when they looked at Chola bronze images and statues, they thought it was absolute exaggeration and they thought it was hideous. Just because it's not real, it's not found. That was the only reason that was given for finding it so hideous. But they go back to their respective countries, and then you have Picasso coming up with an abstract art of a woman where to a literal eye, it doesn't look real at all. It's not how a real person looks like. But they found it was absolute brilliance and sheer brilliance and say liberation from realism. That was the movement. So absolutely, there is biases are inherent. So which is also something that V.S. Ramachandran brought out in one of his talks as well as in his articles, that the purpose also is to question these biases, but he was more enthusiastic about coming up with these universal aesthetic principles, though he acknowledges the bias. But whereas in Indian aestheticians, especially Abhinava Gupta, he does talk about the diversity. How can diverse experiences be? In fact, that was the first question in the slide that I had written. How can diverse experiences be understood, and how do you locate aesthetic experience or the study of aesthetic experience in conditioning? He acknowledges that. Not only that, he also says it's important to be aware of it, which is why cognition and emotion are not entirely separated as two completely different. You may not engage in the process of thinking or cognition, but you may emote. That is one Rasika. Another Rasika is an informed Rasika who thinks, who also, meticulously judges and analyzes and infers. So you have both the Rasikas. So I think Abhinava Gupta has brought out this diversity in how he has studied aesthetics, but not quite in V.S. Ramachandran. According to my reading, I may be wrong.
Thank you, Aparna. We are running a little ahead of our time. I'm sorry, some of our questions now we'll take on our WhatsApp groups. I request the chairperson of today's lecture, Meera Kumar Menon, a doctoral scholar with NIA CSP team, to please proceed with her comments. Meera, over to you.
Harika, and thank you so much, Aparna. I mean, you connected different modes of art, from Van Gogh to Da Vinci, and then from Raga Bhagyashree to Nate, and like different modes of art, and also different concepts from synesthesia to aesthetic concepts like rasa. So that was truly wonderful, and icing for the cake was definitely your singing. So thank you very much for the beautiful, beautiful presentation. I do not have too many comments to make. The discussion itself was very enriching. I just wanted to ask you like one question. It is about, since you are both a classical singer and a dancer, I was wondering, the ideas of Manodharma, singing Manodharma, and Satvika Abhinaya, which is considered probably the highest order of Abhinaya itself. How do you associate it with the involvement in rasa? Would you think that this happens with complete, let's say, complete involvement with rasas, or does it occur when you transcend the rasas? How would you how would you talk about Manodharma and Satvika Abhinaya in this regard?
I think personally, I feel it's when you transcend bhavas, for sure. I'm not sure about transcending rasas because you are part of it, which is why in the very outset itself I had said, if I don't find words or vocabulary to explain what I really wish to, that is probably because I'm not constantly exposed to these areas. So please pardon if I make a mistake. Why? Because I'm not consistently associated with these areas. So yeah, coming back to the question. So transcending rasa, so because the art is created out of the artist as well as the spectator, the artist cannot remain disconnected from the art. And for the creation of art, you need to be involved within the rasa too, the rasa creation too. So knowingly or unknowingly, in fact, that's what was said in neuroaesthetics, that the success of an artist lies in finding out what are those areas of the brain that should be used so that only the critical factors come out, so that you're not cluttered with a lot of other things, so that you are directly transported to that state. And that is what, so which is also what something that explains foreigners reacting to Indian classical music. How can they enjoy, and it's two completely different worlds they may not have been exposed to. So I follow one such channel where these two guys, they've never seen any Indian classical music before, and they listen to Kaushiki Chakrabarti's Theme Class, and then they go bonkers. And probably this could explain the phenomenon that you also partake in the creation of rasa, and you cannot be disconnected, but you may transcend from the existing bhavas and maybe embrace temperamental states like Satvika.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aparna, for the wonderful lecture. It was very lucid, and I want to thank all the participants for their amazing questions and such a great discussion. There are many complimentary comments for you also, Aparna, in the chat box. I'll share with you. So yeah, so thank you so much on that. So we will be opening our WhatsApp group. Meera Kumar Menon will be heading both the WhatsApp groups, and you can ask all your questions or you want to discuss further. Aparna will be answering all the questions there. So yeah, thank you so much. Now on behalf of Professor Sangeeta Menon and also team CSP, and yes, this team is mostly led by women, so thank you for that comment also. So yes, we'll see you next Friday with another speaker. This speaker is a very interesting one. It's from our team, Rakesh Kumar. He'll be presenting his master's thesis, which was on black magic. And so the title for his lecture is a wide eye in the capital of black magic. It's based on Assam. So Rakesh has very interesting pictures and a wonderful PPT to maybe show for the next Friday lecture. So we'll see you next Friday with a new topic and a new speaker. So stay tuned with us, and thank you so much for joining, and have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.